Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Good evening. We will get started in just a minute, but in the meantime, it can be a fun thing if you would put in the chat what city you're joining us from tonight. We'd like to know a little bit more about our participants and can better help us speak to your part of the county potentially. Santa Rosa, excellent. Welcome those just coming in. We're putting in the chat what city you are joining us from tonight. And we will get started in just a minute.
Cool, we've been getting some Southern California participants lately. Last time I think Ojai, maybe? Today, Thousand Oaks. Nice to see lots of Santa Rosa representation. As we partner with City of Santa Rosa and Water Department and Fire to put this one on.
And I'm happy to see someone from Glen Ellen, where we're starting a community wildfire protection plan. Alexis.
Right. Well, we've got a good group to start. So I will say good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this iteration of Resilient Landscaping, Gardening in the Defensible Space Zone. We are going to have 3 presenters tonight, and that will be followed by a panelist discussion, and we will take all of your questions at that time. So as we go through the presentation, if you do have questions, if you could put them in the Q&A box instead of the chat, that's helpful for us to keep track. And our presenters tonight are from the Resilient Landscapes Coalition, as are our panelists, but we also have a very special guest joining us tonight, Paul Lowenthal. He is the Santa Rosa Division Chief Fire Marshal and a member of Fire Safe Sonoma's board. So we are very excited to have him with us tonight. So without any more ado, I will turn it over to our first presenter, John Carnegie.
Hi, thank you, Jen. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This workshop is Resilient Landscaping, Gardening in the Defensible Space Zone, and it's funded by a County of Sonoma Vegetation Management grant. And we thank them for their support in bringing this workshop to you this evening. As Jen said, my name is John Carnegie. I'm a landscape designer and horticulturalist with the Sonoma Ecology Center. And this workshop was created specifically for the Santa Rosa community, although the wider community was invited, and I'm pleased to see that we have some folks from outside of that immediate area. So the Sonoma Ecology Center is a 30-something year-old environmental nonprofit whose mission is to work with the community to identify and lead actions that achieve and sustain ecological health in the Sonoma Valley and beyond. And I'm very happy to be the first of the 3 panelists from the Resilient Landscapes Coalition on the subject of fire-wise and sustainable landscaping. I'm also very pleased that Paul could join us this evening and look forward to hearing his thoughts during the discussion period. I'll before I move on, direct your attention to the subtitle seen on this first slide, Garden as if Life Depends on It. This is a quote from Doug Tallamy. He's a professor of entomology who writes a number of books for gardeners in the popular press. Bringing Nature Home is one of the more popular ones. And this is a quote from that book. And it's referring to the importance of supporting habitat in our home landscapes, because our own lives are very inextricably connected to the natural world around us. I'll get the slide to advance. There we are. A couple of housekeeping items. This is a webinar, and so as such, you do not have audio or video activated. The webinar is being recorded, and as Jen mentioned, questions will work best if you put them in the Q&A box that you'll find down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will use chat quite a bit to reach out to you with some links and other resources, and so it's best if your question and answers go in, or your questions rather go in the Q&A box. Otherwise, they get very lost in the chat very quickly. You'll find as we go through this that we at the Resilient Landscapes Coalition have a pretty strong preference for growing our gardens with native plants, mostly along with, of course, favorite non-natives, due to the adaptability of natives to our climate and how they provide so much habitat for our insects, our pollinators, our wildlife. They're also very beautiful. I changed out my photo here that I usually have on this screen for something a little more current. I just took this the day before yesterday to show that, even at this date in October, after a really high spike in heat, there's still a lot of flowers going on. This is Epilobium canum with the flowers that you see, which is a very popular native called California fuchsia. Behind it, kind of creating a bit of a backdrop, is one of the manzanitas. This one is sunset, and then the wispy grass seed stalks there are California state grass. This is purple needlegrass, Stipa pulchra, a great perennial bunch grass that I'm really enjoying. All right, let's move on. The Resilient Landscapes Coalition is a partnership that was formed a few years ago. The members of that coalition are shown here. They're Fire Safe Sonoma, the Habitat Corridor Project, and the third speaker in this evening's presentation will be April Owens, the founder of that nonprofit. The Sonoma Ecology Center, Ellie, is one of the founders of the Resilient Landscapes Coalition, along with April and Mimi, and is on the board of directors for the Sonoma Ecology Center. And I also come from there within the last 2 years or so. And then the UC Master Gardener program is also a partner. Mimi is here. She's the director of that program. Our second speaker, and Jennifer Roberts, is who introduced this presentation this evening. Also, our work is done in partnership with fire prevention folks like County of Sonoma Fire Prevention Division, CAL FIRE, local fire departments. It's very pleasing to work with them, get their point of view, and make sure that our messages are aligned on this defensible space subject. A quick outline for our presentations this evening. I will start, of course, with some fire context, history, and so forth, also talking about ecology and sustainability around gardens and the landscape. I'll turn it over then to Mimi, who will continue with design and maintenance principles for defensible space. And then April will conclude with a lot of design and planting examples using California native plants. And then we'll have that period of questions and answers, conversation and discussion, including all of the panel and Paul as well. So here we have a lovely scene of a really nice landscape that I think we can think of as something of a model, in that there are flowering plants that are providing nectar and other floral resources for pollinators. The ground is covered with leaf litter from the oak tree above, which would not necessarily be appropriate close to the house, as we'll find, but farther away from the house. Leaf litter is very important for soil and soil health and the health of the trees above. So we're talking about creating and tending landscapes that have multiple benefits, that include fire safety, but also beauty and great wildlife habitat. And we sometimes talk about recovery of a forest after a wildfire as if fire is this bad thing and only bad. It's good to remember, though, that fire is a natural and a very healthy part of many of our ecosystems in California. The loss of a home, though, is of course devastating, and understandably, it doesn't feel, in any way good or natural. And so many folks have responded to those concerns by clearing most of the vegetation from around their homes, and that can result in other problems then of soil erosion if they've cleared the soil down to, or cleared the ground down to the soil level. The growth of weeds that become a fire problem in their own right. Certainly the loss of habitat. Some people have created a sort of a moonscape like this with nothing but gravel, maybe a few widely spaced rocks, maybe a few succulents, but that's not achieving ecological goals, saving a lot of water, I suppose, but not achieving many ecological goals around creation of habitat. And some would argue not terribly pretty. Other folks are a little bit uncertain what to do at all, and so are just kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. And so we're hoping to be here to help folks to create defensible space that's beautiful, that's sustainable, and biodiverse. So many of us choose to live in this area because of its tremendous natural beauty, and we're coming to understand more and more that the land rather is adapted to fire, and it seems like we're becoming much more comfortable with the notion of prescribed fire in natural areas where that's appropriate. So the watersheds in the Santa Rosa area are going to be made up of grasslands, some chaparral, oak, and mixed conifer woodlands, a lot of diversity, which is wonderful for us. And these different vegetation types were tended for thousands of years by native peoples, using fire as a tool to improve hunting, acorn harvest, desirable stands of plants for food and fiber. These indigenous practices resulted in healthy wildlands where low intensity and frequent fire prevented the development of these very large fuel loads that invite these occasional catastrophic wildfires that are now putting human lives and our structures at risk. I'm really related to this idea of indigenous people managing wildlands. I'm really enjoying a book right now that's called Tending the Wild by M. Cat Anderson. It's published, I believe, by the University of California Press. And it's all about the native California management of these natural resources. I recommend it if that's of some interest to you. So our plant communities in this area and much of the United States West are fire adapted systems. But the combination of fire suppression over the past century or two, along with climate change and its warmer and drier conditions and the more intense winds, have brought us catastrophic wildfires. And at that same time, we're developing further and further into those wildlands, creating a real sort of nexus of problems here. So while low intensity frequent fire is part of a forest's natural cycle and is part of a healthy forest ecosystem, catastrophic wildfire is costly, it's traumatic for unprepared landowners. We have to combine this defensible space work that we're talking about tonight with forest management work that might use prescribed fire where that's appropriate, and it can use other management techniques where it just simply isn't appropriate. So let's look at a bit of history around fires in our area, with the exception of a few fires, including Hanley fire, which is this big curve here north of Santa Rosa in 1964. Most fires during this period of 1935 to 2014 were typically less than 10,000 acres. But what we're seeing now more recently, and you're all familiar with this, during this 6-year period of 2015 to 2020, we've got very large fires, the Kincaid, the Walbridge, the Glass, the Nuns fires, all greater than 50,000 acres. We also have this issue that I mentioned of human development moving into the wildlands. So let me take a moment to describe these maps. The two maps of the same, exact same area taken are showing the situation in 1964 when that Hanley fire occurred, and in 2017 when the Tubbs fire shared a very similar footprint. So what you're looking at here, the red sort of blob in this area, if you can see my, my pointer, is the city of Santa Rosa, showing high density housing development in the city. In 1964, and then if you look at the same map in 2017, you see how much larger that high density housing development is. The yellow represents low density housing development, and it almost fills the map in much of the area, well into the mountains here to the east of Santa Rosa. And again, this pink outline shows the two fires, the Hanley in 1964, the Tubbs in 2017. You see they have a very similar footprint, and this study by Keeley and Sifford points out that the conditions, the vegetation, the weather conditions were very similar for both, but the Tubbs fire was much more catastrophic. It resulted in greater loss of life, far greater loss of structures, simply because we're moving into that path. So expansion of what's called the wildland urban interface, or WUI, sometimes we say, brings greater more ignitions because of this expansion of the power grid, greater, more cars, more people, more traffic, greater loss of life and property, a greater need to suppress fires because of the life and the property that's there. And the added problem, putting fire aside for a moment, that wildlife habitat is also greatly fragmented, making it difficult for many plant and animal species and the entire ecological system to thrive. So it may be a question of avoiding building more in the WUI, but regardless, we're there now, and it's our responsibility to do what we can to take care of the land and to take care of the human and wildlife that are there. Let's have a look at risk and fire hazard severity, and just mention that there are defensible space regulations that you should be aware of. So when considering risk, you want to consider the full range from a very broad regional level down to a community and then personal level. And this map that's shown now considers that first, that broader landscape element. This is the CAL FIRE Fire Hazard Severity Zone map for Sonoma County. And the colored parts of the map are state responsibility areas. White parts are mostly local responsibility areas. And then looking at the colored areas, the red is the very high fire hazard severity zones as rated by CAL FIRE, orange, the high fire hazard severity, and the yellow is moderate. So the city of Santa Rosa is here, and all three are there or very near. There will be some updated mapping done in the future. There's also mapping at the Sonoma County level. So Sonoma County has something called the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, or CWPP. They're working on updating that. And if you just go do an internet search for Sonoma County Sonoma County Community Wildfire Protection Plan, or CWPP, you will get some good information, including the county level mapping of wildfire hazard. Regulations run from that sort of broad state level with State Resources Code 4291 down to Sonoma County level. City of Santa Rosa has code around defensible space and weed abatement that applies to defensible space. There are going to be additional requirements in high and very high fire hazard severity zones. I think Mimi might mention this in a bit, around the creation of this 0 to 5 foot zone away from your house. Some special things that need to be done in that so-called zone 0. And then thinking about risk, you want to, again, think from that broad level down to your own property and your own home. Ask yourself things like, what are the vegetation patterns in the broader landscape around the community? How do those contribute to potential fuels? What are the resources and conditions in my neighborhood? So now we're thinking about like the roads that provide evacuation, ingress and egress, the ability for fire protection folks to get to you, that sort of thing. Resources that are there, whether they be fire hydrants on the corners or the lack of them, and the need to provide water in other ways for fire protection. And then think of what are the conditions on your own property, including the topography if you have a larger property. Has the home been assessed? Have home hardening practices been completed? Mimi will emphasize that that's the place to start, is with the home. It's not with the landscape. Start with home hardening, and then consider what steps you can take working out into the landscape. So, and then you think about what's your personal perspective on risk and how you're going to balance that that perception of risk with other factors like the sustainability goals, the aesthetics of a landscape, the costs of making home improvements. And one has to, of course, follow the regulations that are out there. But there is often, some level of flexibility there. For example, this California State Code 4291 says that the amount of fuel modification necessary shall consider the flammability of the structure. And these other things, building standards, location, and type of vegetation. So it's not a one size fits all sort of a thing. You have some ability to balance and make decisions. Make your own, do your own assessment of risk and tolerance, but remember, this is the last point here, your risk decisions will intersect with those of your neighbors. So be careful of that. Let's look at the 3 types of fire exposure to a home during wildfire events. We have these 3 types. Radiant heat is when a burning structure or burning something, the heat from it will cause something else to alight. There's not direct flame contact there. And this can happen frequently from one home to a nearby home, or in this case, an outbuilding to the house itself. Direct flame contact is when the fire of a wildfire, for example, of a forest, let's say, burns right up to the property edge and then continues on up to the house. And while this can happen, it's less likely than the third. And this would suggest, this direct flame contact would suggest that you need to go out here to the edge of the landscape and start working there. But what the truth of the matter is that embers cause the majority of wildfire losses of homes, embers being little bits of vegetation that are on fire and floating around, coming from that fire front, the edge of the wildfire. These embers will sort of rain down on the property like rain, like snow, actually, because they blow around in the wind. And thinking that that's the main cause, which it is, the greatest cause of structure fires, causes us to think about, okay, so those are going to land on the home, on the roof. They're going to land on the landscape because they're blowing around. They're going to accumulate in certain corners in the roof and of the walls. They're going to blow up against the foundation of the home. So that's where we need to be thinking, and that's where the defensible space recommendations that we're going to be giving, that's what they're based upon. So you can imagine a landscape such as this, home and landscape, and then imagine dropping in some embers and just think about, well, what's going to happen? Where is the ember likely to ignite a fire? And if so, how far does that fire move before it's stopped by some, perhaps it's the rock wall here, or the boulders. Will it get into what are called ladder fuels, lower vegetation that will allow the flames to get up into the canopies of these trees, for example? In this landscape, it doesn't look like that would be very likely to happen. And of course, they're going to rain down on the roof. They're going to try to blow into or get sucked into vents and so forth. And so the maintenance of cleanliness of the roof and of the foundation of the home is going to be very important, knowing that embers are our greatest cause of wildfire, home ignitions. And now let's shift into ecology and sustainability a bit in the defensible space zone. If we're going to be reimagining our landscapes a little bit, whether it's removing a few bushes that are right up against the house, or whether it's a sort of an overhaul of the whole garden, we have a great opportunity as we do these activities to reconsider our home and landscapes through the lens not only of the fire resiliency, but to design them so that they can play an important role in restoring the ecological system and encouraging sustainability. So human development has fragmented a lot of our wildlands, as was mentioned earlier. We tend to think of forests and grasslands and chaparral as the home for wildlife, not our gardens so much. But these wildlands are now so chopped up and fragmented that our home gardens are in fact needed to provide critical habitat. So this Doug Tallamy, the entomologist that I mentioned earlier, and the author of that book, Bringing Nature Home, he promotes the idea of making our gardens into habitat oases. And he provides this statement: for the first time in history, gardeners have become important players in the management of our nation's wildlife. So our gardens can provide some critical ecosystem services. One of them is shade or air conditioning for our properties. There's aesthetics. They enrich the soil and help hold it in place. They're going to intercept stormwater, allow it to get down to the soil without so much impact, slowing it down. Plants and how we shape the land can help slow, spread, and sink stormwater so that it will eventually be stored. That is to say, it'll percolate into the groundwater. Plants, of course, sequester carbon, and so trees are enormously important as part of the whole climate crisis solution. And then, of course, plants, and in particular, of course, native plants will support birds and other pollinators. So I love this image in particular because I like insects a lot. But insects are, in fact, very important because so many animals rely on insects, either directly or indirectly, for food. And without insects, there wouldn't be much other higher life. In fact, we hear a lot lately about the significant loss of insect biodiversity. Sometimes you hear as much as 75 or 80% over the last few decades. You hear similar numbers for breeding pairs of songbirds. The Western monarch butterfly has been an important example of insect population declines. So studies are showing that the loss of habitat is a primary driver, along with pesticide use and climate changes. And it's important that we take steps to protect and create habitat as we manage wildland fuels. Simply put, native plants like these that are shown here, these are some California, some buckwheats shown here, Eriogonum species. The plants like these provide better habitat and resources for native insects, and our insects are a primary food source for birds and reptiles, amphibians, fish, mammals. So how can we support biodiversity? April will give examples of lots of great native species, how to use them, and the benefits that they provide. But some of the things we can do are choose those native species, at least 70 or 80%. So there's room for our tomatoes and our lemon tree and favorite flowers. But native plants are going to improve biodiversity by providing food in the form of fruits and seeds and leaves and insects and nectar to wildlife that have evolved with these native plants over millennia, bringing in something from outside of our area: Japanese maple, crepe myrtle. It's kind of like putting statuary in the landscape. As far as habitat that's provide, it's relatively little compared to many native species. Just a quick example, and it comes from the Talamy research team, that for a chickadee pair to raise a clutch of nestlings, they must catch between 6,240 to 9,120 caterpillars just to raise a single a nest of nestlings. So suburban yards with mostly non-native landscape plants they found in a study, produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So these crepe myrtles, Japanese maples just aren't, providing the number of caterpillars and other bugs to really benefit the native birds and other wildlife that we love to have around. So some other tips would be to plant islands of plants, clusters of plants for bird and butterfly food and shelter. You want to consult calscape.org. It's a wonderful resource. I use it all of the time to find appropriate plants and the habitat they provide. We want to use integrated pest management to really, avoid use of pesticides as much as possible. And we want to provide a water source for wildlife as well. Summer months. Another way to support biodiversity is to keep all of our plants healthy, particularly trees, just because bigger trees have bigger benefits. Shown here are some oak trees in the back, and oak trees are especially important. They're a keystone species, meaning that they're very closely connected to lots of different species of other species of plants and animals. So if they were pulled out of the system, if they were removed, the impacts would be tremendous. So here's a photo of a bit of oak woodland with an understory of coral bells, a native flowering plant, which is drought tolerant. It won't damage the root system, doesn't require a lot of irrigation that might upset the health of the oak tree above. So oak trees are incredibly productive food factories for wildlife. They provide not only acorns, which is kind of the first thing they think of, but they host these huge numbers of insects and caterpillars that support so many of our favorite garden birds, like quail, bluebirds, robins, orioles, and of course the acorns do provide a lot of food for acorn woodpeckers, blue jays, squirrels, and lots of other vertebrates. So we want to keep oak trees healthy for the habitat that they provide, and also because a declining tree, just like a declining plant of any stature, is going to be very fire prone. We'll want to protect the root system of oaks in particular, minimizing irrigation, minimizing compaction and traffic over the root system, digging within the drip line. And you want to extend that protection zone around an oak tree as wide as possible. Really important is to keep, to think of leaf litter as a great resource. Leaf litter, just simply the leaves that fall from the tree and provide a natural mulch. They support insects and birds, microorganisms and roots, really important for forest health, important in garden health as well. But we'll learn that in the closer to the house, we don't want to have a combustible mulch. And I'll allow Mimi to go into those guidelines around the use of mulch and how we can allow leaf litter. Another way to enhance biodiversity is to prevent the invasion of exotic weedy plants. In the larger photo on the right, we see a hill slope here that appears to have been, maybe some sort of vegetation management, but you see a lot of exposed soil. And what often can happen then is invasion by invasive species. So in the photo on the left, so it's superimposed, is a shot showing some Scotch broom. There's a number of species of broom that are exotics. They're highly invasive, produce tremendous amounts of seeds. They often follow after a fire, taking advantage of that sort of temporary vacuum of life. They're very fire prone themselves. So really one of the first objectives on a property that has invasives like broom is to work on removing those plants before other restoration activities. when plants are removed as part of a landscape, rethinking around defensible space, it's really important to think about the timing. It's very important. As birds are nesting in larger vegetation and smaller, down on the ground and so forth, mostly in the months between or from March to August. And so pruning, plant removal should ideally be done September to February. It's also a time when a lot of plants are becoming dormant, and so there's other advantages around that. But want to watch for bird nests whenever we're doing activities in the vegetation, including nesting that might be on the ground. I'll touch on a few more defensible space ecosystem services before I turn the microphone over to Mimi. Plants and landscapes also enrich soil and hold it in place. They're covering the soil here, protecting it from rain erosion. All plants will sequester carbon. I have a slide just to talk about that real quickly in a moment. They'll encourage water to infiltrate, protect water quality. What soil is kept out of the watershed up above will keep creeks and rivers cleaner, which has great benefits for salmon and other aquatic species. A quick mention about sequestration of carbon. If you're forgetting your plant physiology from high school, I'll remind you that something that plants do, and pretty much only plants can do, is take carbon dioxide from the air, energy from the sun, use these things along with water from the soil to break apart that carbon dioxide, use the carbon in growing tissues, growing new cells, new roots, new flowers, and so forth. They liberate oxygen, which we need to breathe, so they're critical for that. And a lot of this carbon that goes into plant parts ends up in the soil. Either leaves fall or root cells are sloughed off. Of course, insects and other animals come along and eat these plant tissues, and that carbon ends up in the soil. And the soil is a tremendous sink or storage place for carbon. The soil can hold more carbon than the atmosphere can, more than the above ground plant parts and animal life combined. So it's a truly underutilized resource. Carbon sequestration requires many healthy plants and healthy soils. Trees are better because they're bigger and they do it more than little plants. So let's continue to plant trees and grow healthy trees. Part of how we can do that is with healthy soil. Soil is this network of more than just the mineral part. It includes the roots and insects, fungi, organic matter, earthworms that are all sort of fueled by the fallen leaves and organic mulch. So we want to retain and incorporate organic matter in the soil. We want to keep soil covered with plants, with mulch, and with leaf litter where that's appropriate. Again, that's mulch is part of the defensible space decision making, and so there are some guidelines around where and where that's appropriate and where it isn't. We should avoid synthetic fertilizers that really kind of burn through the carbon that's in the soil. Just one more. Slide before I close is just a few ideas on water, keeping storm water on our property, keeping city water that we might purchase on the property as well, where that's possible. So here we see sort of a bioswale that holds stormwater just temporarily, just for a few days after the rain, allowing it to percolate into the soil rather than running out into the street and down to the nearest drain, which shoots it off to the creek as quickly as possible, which often causes some bank erosion and incising and things like that. So best to keep that water on your property. It's good for your own plants and good for the groundwater in your area. And then the water that we might use for laundry, for example, can be used in the landscape, the rinse water, if we set up a system for that appropriately and choose laundry detergents that are appropriate for that. There's good resources at an organization called Daily Acts, which is based in Petaluma. So dailyacts.org. Save Water has great resources like this one on what they call a laundry to landscape gray water project. And then this slide shows how rainwater can be collected from the roof, in this case of a small barn at Sonoma Garden Park, a City of Sonoma park that Sonoma Ecology Center manages. That water is stored in a tank for a little bit of summertime irrigation. So some neat ideas that might inspire you there around stormwater. So with that, I'll encourage you to become a little bit more intimate with the garden and the wildlife neighbors that visit it or would like to visit it, while reducing your fire risk and enhancing biodiversity. So, and with that, I'll turn it over to Mimi Enright. Again, Mimi is a program manager for the UC Master Gardener program of Sonoma County, and she'll talk about design and maintenance principles. Thank you so much. Let me stop sharing here and turn it over to Mimi.
Thank you, John. Let me do my screen logistics here for just a minute. Great. Now, are you seeing my presentation?
It looks good, Mimi.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. Good evening, everybody. Wonderful to have so many folks here from Santa Rosa area and around Sonoma County joining us tonight, and some folks from Southern California. Wonderful to see that as well. Hopefully you are all, many of you at least, are familiar with who the Master Gardeners are and what we do. We're trained agents of the University of California, and our mission is to extend the educational outreach of the university to our communities. And we do that with a focus on sustainable landscape principles as our core message. And our goal as the Resilient Landscapes Coalition, when we came together, we were seeing the same tensions at the same time across Habitat Corridor Project and the Master Gardener Program and Sonoma Ecology Center of tensions between some of the principles that we advocate for sustainable landscaping and some of the defensible space recommendations. So that started us on our path of looking at marrying those principles together. And why is that important? As John so eloquently shared, our climate is changing. And so our landscapes, and we truly believe that each property can and should make a difference if they can. So I'm going to be sharing some basic information with you about defensible space and the design and maintenance opportunities you have to create a more fire-wise and sustainable landscape moving ahead. Hopefully, my goal is to give you a framework for assessing your landscape with a fire-wise lens. The picture in this slide is in the hills above my home. I live northeast of Cloverdale by about 5 minutes in the old Preston Faith Healing community. That great slide where John talked about each of us are assessing our own risk. I live in a very high fire severity zone on a slope directly abutting wildlands. In fact, on the east side of my house, my 30 to 100 foot defensible space zone is in the wildlands. And on the south side of my house, my 30 to 100 foot zone is my neighbor's property. So that means my risk factor, as John discussed, is very high. Each of us does need to assess our own risk as we plan our actions to increase our safety moving forward so we're better protected during a wildfire. So we have a lot of territory to cover in a really short amount of time. And I tend to talk really fast, so we're going to move through a lot of concepts. I'm going to start off by doing a quick touch on some basic principles, then discuss how to design your home landscape with fire in mind based on the different zones in the 0 to 100 foot zone around your home or structures on your property called the defensible space zone. We'll do a quick review of mulch and ongoing maintenance, which truly is one of the most important aspects of continuing to keep our properties as ready as we can before the next fire. So let's dive right on in. So here's the bottom line. I think all of us here in Sonoma County are very aware of this, but what you do to prepare your home and landscape for the next fire truly does matter. We know the truths, what the truths are in this slide. Your actions to prepare for the next wildfire really are key. And we all know how hard our firefighters, like Paul, have worked to protect our homes and our communities during fire events. But given the scope of the wildfires we've seen, we also know that we can't assume that there will be a shiny red truck parked outside your home when fire does come. So attending this workshop is a really great step, but coming to the meeting isn't just enough. We're thrilled you all did. It is the perfect step forward, but we hope you take at least a few items of action that you'll go forward with implementing in your home to be better prepared as we move forward. So let's dive on in. So I want to cover a few basics about fire and fuel, which are really important to the context of our conversation today. So very basically, fire must have 3 elements in order to burn. That's fuel, oxygen, and heat. And which of these elements can we control? That's the fuel aspect of that equation. And fuel, very basically, is anything that will burn. But we certainly know in our home landscapes that can be vegetation from trees, woody shrubs or perennials, landscape mulch, fencing, roofing, decks, lawn furniture, broom leaning against your house that's left out during a wildfire event, arbors, trellises, planter boxes, all of those represent possible fuel that may burn during a wildfire. So John discussed the 3 types of fire threat to structures. And defensible space strategies have historically focused on how to reduce that direct flame content. But preparing for embers and radiant heat exposures takes a different approach. So we really are seeing an evolution of defensible space recommendations with a focus especially on a new zone called Zone 0, which I'm going to talk about in some more depth in a few minutes, as well as recommendations for home hardening. So here are some basic Firewise landscaping principles. Resilient landscape design is about plant selection and placement, the overall garden design with hardscape elements, and maintenance. And we hope that all of this is done with a lens of sustainability. John did such a great job about talking about various aspects of landscape sustainability, like retaining water on your property, conserving water and energy, supporting wildlife, and sequestering carbon. So I want to highlight that there is not scientific research to support all of the recommendations in my presentation. I will point out through the presentation where recommendations are supported by scientific research, however. And also, as we go through today's presentation, any items that you see highlighted in red represent County of Sonoma code requirements. So let's start with some key basic foundational recommendations to make your landscape more firewise. You want to make sure you remove all dead or dying plants and branches and remove ladder fuels, and you should be doing this on a continuous basis. From a design perspective, you want to create islands of plantings optimally separated with non-combustible paths between them to interrupt the path or flow of fire through your landscape. You want to avoid planting or mulching close to structures. And you want to prune tree limbs up to at least 6 feet from the ground, or at least or 1/3 of that tree height if it's a shorter tree. And we'll go into many of these principles in more detail as we move through my presentation. I want to highlight that it's critically important that you don't have anything that directly connects to your home that is organic, that could transmit fire to your structures. And that absolutely includes wooden gates and fencing. As well as hedges or even wooden edging around your beds if that connects up to your house. So you want to consider alternatives that are non-organic where you can. Hopefully, I've touched briefly on the concept of ladder fuels just a few slides back. Hopefully you're all familiar with the concept of ladder fuels. The goal, as John talked about, is to reduce the possibility of having fire move up from that ground plane up into the crown of trees. So you want to avoid planting shrubs under trees. If you do have shrubs under trees, you want to make sure you allow at least 3 times the height of that shrub between the top of the shrub and the lowest tree limb. Again, you want to limb up all your trees at least 6 feet from the ground or 1/3 the height of the tree. And then it's critical to continue to maintain that as it grows. So here's some work that our colleague Ellie from the Resilient Landscapes Coalition did at her property to remove some ladder fuels. In this case, she was managing an older juniper shrub below a tree. And on the lower left, the picture shows you that, of course, the upper left is the before picture before she did the cleanup work. On the lower left, that shows some cleanup work she did to the interior of the juniper shrub to clean out old dead branches and debris. And then on the right, you see where she's pulled that back away to create some separation from the tree. And then she assures us, though, it's a little deceptive in the picture, that she does have 3 times the height of that juniper shrub to the lowest limb of that tree that's towering over it. So how can you apply a Firewise lens to plant selection? Many of you may be hoping for a fire-resistant plant list, but the reality is that all plants can burn. They are organic and they can burn. And there's some really compelling pictures from the Tubbs fire of some succulents that burned in the Fountain Grove area. So it's really much more important to consider where you place a plant in your landscape and then how you maintain it on an ongoing basis. So you want to make sure you're choosing plants that will grow to a size that's appropriate for their location. So when you pick up that little 4-inch pot with a plant at the nursery, You need to really pay attention to what its mature size will be and where you are planning to put it in your landscape. And some of those small plants in those 4-inch pots can grow to be very large. So you really want to make sure you're locating plants where excess pruning is not then required by you to maintain desired spacing, whether it's from a home or from other plant materials. Are you putting the plant somewhere where it will thrive? If it's a plant that prefers shade, are you putting it in full sun? And trust me, I've been guilty of that before. And we know that that's going to create a less vigorous plant that's going to require more maintenance and more water, and has a higher susceptibility to fire. Are you up for the maintenance that plant will require? And really, what is your appetite for ongoing maintenance in your landscape? And that's a really important consideration that we all need to keep in mind if we're going to be maintaining these landscapes, which we certainly hope you all do. We're hoping to convince you how important, what the important services that our landscapes play in our environment. You really need to assess and understand what your appetite is for maintaining that appropriately to keep it fire-wise and ready for future fires. Is the plant invasive? John showed that great picture of Scotch broom, and will it possibly spread to a neighbor's property and create a fire threat? And you also want to consider how a plant might change over its lifespan. And I think lavender is a really great example. It's a really kind of ubiquitously used plant here in wine country, but it starts out as herbaceous and becomes much more woody over time. So after being really deeply enmeshed in this topic, I've started to see my landscape through a different lens. And I really think about how fire might move through the landscape around my home and how much fuel is there that would add to that fire. How much woody mass is there? With that lens, last winter, I cut back some larger salvias that had become really very woody. And they grew back beautifully in the spring with much more herbaceous stems with less woody mass. They'll become woody again in a year or two, and I will cut them back again. But if you don't want to do that kind of ongoing regular maintenance, which as a plant geek, I am clearly committed to, then plant selection for how a plant might change over time is an important consideration as well. So there's also specific recommendations for where not to plant. And we'll go into some more detail very soon on that 0 to 5 foot, that zone 0 perimeter around your house and structures. And the recommendation, particularly if you're in a higher fire risk area, or have a higher risk assessment that you've made for your property, it's particularly important to not do any, plant any organic plants or use mulch in that 0 to 5 foot zone around your house. You also want to avoid planting under vents and eaves, in front of windows or combustible siding, under or near decks. Those are all areas where fire or embers could introduce flames into your home quite readily. And those inside corners in houses, that's where embers can tend to accumulate. It's fascinating to look at some videos online during tests that they've done in laboratories and to see the kind of eddies that develop with winds in those inside corners with embers. Okay, so let's dive into the zones that make up that 0 to 100 foot defensible space zone around your home and your structures on your property. So as John stressed, your starting point is your house, and we're not going into the topic of home hardening today, as our focus is on the landscape, but there are many wonderful resources that help guide you through the home hardening process. This graphic depicts the different defensible space zones in your home landscape that we're going to be discussing today. So after you've hardened your home, you want to then move out to work on the 0 to 5 foot zone around your structures, then work on your 5 to 30 foot zone, and then on your 30 to 100 foot zone. Okay, so the first zone we're going to discuss is that zone 0, which is called the Ember Defense Zone. And this really is a relatively newer zone introduced into the defensible space recommendations. I have to say, when Ellie and April and I came together, it's probably 3 or 4 years ago to start creating this content to share with the community. But we couldn't find any good graphics that showed zone 0, the Ember Defense Zone. So it's very new in the lexicon, but it is, I want to stress that this zone is supported by scientific research. Zone 0 absolutely will reduce the likelihood of structure ignition by reducing the potential for direct ignition of the structure from flame contact, by embers that could accumulate at the base of a wall, and or indirect ignitions when embers ignite vegetation, vegetative debris, or other combustible materials located close to the structure that then result in either a radiant heat or direct flame contact exposure to that structure. So this zone is closest to the house, so it requires the most careful selection and management of vegetation and other possible fuels. So classically, we've massed shrubs against the house, called foundation shrubs. So this is really a big shift away from how we have traditionally designed our landscapes. And a lot of people really struggle with it. But we really need to think about the fuel that this generates for fire in immediate proximity to our homes and structures. Optimally, there should be no combustible materials in this zone. At a minimum, you want to remove or minimize planting in more vulnerable places where fire could enter your home, like I discussed just a minute ago, under vents and eaves, in front of windows, or combustible siding, and under or near decks. And as we discussed, again, you don't want to have any fences or wood gates attached to the house, as they can directly move fire to your home. And again, that also applies to hedges. So during a wildfire, as John discussed, thousands of embers can rain down on roofs and pelt the side of the home like hail during a storm. And then embers, as he also stressed, embers coming into contact with flammable material is the major reason why homes are destroyed during wildfire. I want to highlight that we aren't suggesting that you have to remove trees if they are in the 0 to 5 foot zone. John, one of the aspects of what John talked about with sustainable landscaping is that trees provide really important shade during the summer to reduce energy needs inside your home. And during those extreme heat waves, they can also provide shade to surrounding plant materials. The most important aspect to consider with trees closer to your home is what debris they drop that you then need to maintain on your roof and in those zones immediately around your structures. So it can make your maintenance easier if you remove any limbs within 6 feet of your roof. And then, of course, you also want to focus on regularly removing any dead or dry plant material in zone 0. So during a red flag warning day, or if you have to evacuate from your house due to a fire, and if you have time, you want to make sure you clean up any debris in this zone around your structures and on your roof. For example, I have an oak tree that's in my 5 to 30 foot zone and probably within about 10 feet of my house that drops twigs and acorns and leaves nearly year round. So I am absolutely in my high fire severity zone out on a red flag warning day to clean up any debris in that 0 to 5 foot zone. I also want to highlight that it is a county code requirement, that last bullet highlighted in red, to cut any tree limbs within 10 feet of a stovepipe or chimney outlet. And you need to maintain that spacing year round. Okay, let's move on to zone 1, which is the 5 to 30 foot zone. This is commonly referred to as the home defense zone. This is likely the zone where firefighters will make a stand if they are working to defend your home from a wildfire. So you want to really keep that in mind to ensure that they have ease of access. So zone 1 reduces the likelihood of fire burning directly to the structure, and that's accomplished by modifying fuels and creating a discontinuity between planting groups, those islands that we talked about, that limits pathways for fire to burn to the structure, so it reduces the potential for near to building ember generation and radiant heat exposures. So again, the recommendation in this zone is to plant in islands or groupings of plantings that are separated by pathways. Certainly in a higher risk area, you might want to consider making those pathways non-combustible, like you're using gravel or concrete. And again, to reiterate, that goal is to interrupt the flow of fire to your home. Plantings in this zone should optimally be herbaceous, which means not woody, and 3 feet in height or less. And you can consider inclusion of a shrub or trees, but optimally you would want to pick a specimen or a single tree or shrub rather than masses. And you want to make sure, again, that all plants are readily accessible for regular maintenance, as you want to keep all the plants in this zone clear of any dead plant material. And this is really a great zone for incorporating hardscape, such as patios, that creates that break to break up the flow of the fire. So the basics in zone 1 from a design lens are low growing, mostly perennial plants that are well maintained, and consider inclusion of hardscape to break up those planted areas. Here's an example of a Santa Rosa home with a dry creek bed. It's a great use of hardscape for plant grouping separation in that 5 to 30 foot zone. and also accomplishes another goal of helping to slow that water, that slow it, spread it, sink it concept that John talked about, to slow the spread of water from moving off side of the property into our storm drains and soak it into the soils, which helps to maintain healthier plants and recharge our water systems. Okay, let's move on to zone 2, or the 30 to 100 foot zone. This is called the reduced fuel zone. And actions in this zone are designed to reduce the potential behavior of an oncoming fire in such a way as to drop approaching fire from the crown to the ground. So we have the same basic principles as the 5 to 30 foot zone, but you can include shrubs and trees in widely spaced groupings. You want to continue the focus on creating islands of vegetation. Ensure that you have easy access for maintenance, and wider pathways can certainly help facilitate that access. And continue your vigilance, of course, on ladder fuel removal and regularly removing any dead plant materials. Want to point out that it is a county code requirement, that second bullet in red, that all annual grasses must be mowed to 4 inches in height during fire season. And if you've moved any wood piles to this zone during the winter, so you don't have to trek out as far to stoke your fireplace, you want to move those wood piles out to this zone 2, this 30 to 100 foot zone, and then during the fire season, and then ensure that you have nothing combustible located near that pile within 10 feet of all directions. Okay, so these are CAL FIRE recommendations for plant spacing guidelines within 100 feet of your home. And I want to stress that these are not mandated by law or supported by scientific research, but they are certainly based on the experience of our firefighters fighting fires. These guidelines for spacing are due to flame height and are based on the slope of the land around the home, which is a major consideration in assessing your wildfire risk. I think we're all familiar with the fact that a fire will burn faster and more intensely as it moves uphill rather than along flat ground, and a steeper slope will result in a faster moving fire with longer flame lengths. So this graphic is depicting shrub spacing, and we have gotten concurrence from our firefighting officials that low-growing, well-irrigated grasses or ground covers or perennials would be considered to be acceptable between these plant groupings. But again, each of us needs to assess our own individual overall personal degree of risk acceptance and the degree of risk for fire on our properties, which of course includes that consideration of slope, to make appropriate decisions in our own home landscapes. This graphic is depicting suggested horizontal tree spacing as well as vertical separation, those ladder fuels we discussed earlier. Note again the depiction at that the top picture and all the pictures on the right of 3 times the height of the shrub from the top of the shrub to the lowest tree branches. Horizontal spacing on less than a 20% slope of 10 feet is recommended. And then of course on steeper slopes, the recommended distance is increased. So as John highlighted, we don't need to denude our landscapes in the 100-foot perimeter around our home, but we certainly want to make sure we have spacing to reduce the fuel volume and help break up the flow of fire to the house. Here's a great East Bay mud graphic that shows before and after maintenance for an existing mature landscape. I know it's probably easy to wrap your head around the concepts of what we're proposing if you're starting from scratch with a landscape, but how do you tackle it with an existing mature landscape? In the before picture on the upper left, we see no break-in planted areas. We see shrubs massed against the house. And after maintenance, on the lower right, we see islands of vegetation, shrubs next to the house removed, trees limbed up and ladder fuels removed, and shrubs and trees have been thinned. So you want to make sure that you, your family, and firefighters have clear access in and out of your property. What would you do to make this driveway more fire-wise? You would want to cut that grass during fire season to 4 inches in height, those same principles from zone 2. You want to limb up those trees. Certainly, the recommendation is to maintain vegetation on both sides of roads and driveway, 10 feet from the road edge and then 15 feet vertically, and ensure that you have 12 feet of unobstructed pavement for the passage of vehicles, especially those fire trucks if they're coming in to defend your home. So once you've done the work to harden your home and prepare your defensible space, it's really important to reach out to and work with your neighbors You want to work together to develop a fuel reduction plan, watch for maintenance needed, and really try to consider the total volume of vegetation in the area. I have to say, I went for a hike on Sunday with a neighbor up in the wildlands up above my and our neighbors' homes, and it was really gratifying to see all the work that a number of our neighbors on all sides of us have been doing to create shaded fuel breaks, because we are all directly adjacent to the wildland urban interface. And it certainly helps me sleep better at night to know that that we and all our neighbors have done this preparatory work. So shaded fuel breaks, if you reside in a more densely forested area, you can help control that fire behavior by reducing ladder fuels, opening up the canopy and maintaining those ground fuels that will help firefighters with fire suppression during a fire. But because new vegetation will regenerate in these areas, reentry into the stand is necessary every few years. Again, this is the shaded fuel break depiction that's directly beyond the east side of my house. This is my 30 to 100 foot zone. So again, in the context of our very high fire severity hazard zone, directly adjacent to the wildland urban interface, this is really important work for our neighbors and us to be doing. It's really hard to see. This is actually a shot from my 0 to 5 foot zone, looking across to my neighbor's property, again, within my 100 foot defensible space zone. I'm not sure you can clearly see it, but my neighbor had done extensive work in that creating that shaded field break up at the hill in the wildland behind our homes to create that preparedness for us. And that's actually piles of brush waiting to be chipped by the free chipping program. So again, in our small neighborhood, many of us are working very hard in our defensible space, especially in the context of our higher risk. And it's really exciting to see neighborhoods coming together like this, all the different COPE groups, all the neighborhood community groups that are coming together to work on fire preparedness. It is an ongoing process with all the maintenance needed every year, but certainly we've been making incremental improvements to make our home and neighborhood better prepared for future fires that will certainly keep our firefighters safer in future events as well. So from a maintenance perspective, throughout the year, again, you want to continuously monitor for removing dead plants and dead branches from trees and shrubs. That is a county code requirement. And it's recommended to remove vines from trees and shrubs. I have some vines on some fences around my home, and I've cut them back hard when they get lots of woody debris and dead leaf debris built up in it, and they've rejuvenated really beautiful. So that's definitely an ongoing maintenance requirement I'm going to be doing in my garden to keep my property better prepared. Here are maintenance recommendations for you to take annually before fire season. John did a really great job stressing that you want to do your pruning and vegetation thinning in fall and early winter. Now's the time to avoid harm to bird breeding. You don't want to cut grass to bare dirt. It's important to keep viable vegetation in place for erosion control. You want to be particularly sensitive about dry leaf litter at the beginning of fire season. And we certainly should probably starting to pay attention to this as early as May or June, when it seems to be that our fire season is starting now. Again, those highlighted in red county code requirements for mowing annual grasses and weeds to 4 inches tall or less, and moving wood piles to 30 feet from the building and covering them optimally with fire resistant tarps and clearing surrounding vegetation. So John talked about that leaf litter maintenance. Certainly with my personal risk assessment in a very high fire severity zone, I'm being vigilant about keeping leaf litter out of my 0 to 5 foot zone. I do thin the depth of leaf litter in my 5 to 30 foot zone because of the proximity to my house and my high fire severity risk to just a couple of inches. The trees are rejuvenating generating lots more, so it's not a problem for that getting regenerated. But again, each of us needs to make our own personal assessment for management of leaf litter, which does provide really important ecosystem services based on our fire risk. Every few years is needed. You want to make sure you're going in to thin and reduce your tree canopies to remove any twiggy growth and maintain that separation between the trees and try to reduce some of your overall fuel load. Again, I think I've reiterated this plenty of times. You want to keep the lowest branches of the trees pruned up at least 6 feet from the ground. Cut back those ground covers and vines to remove any buildup of dry stems and leaves, and cut back shrubs to renew them. So mulch is a really important aspect of sustainable landscapes. It helps with weed suppression and water conservation. but wood mulches are organic, and as such, they're combustible materials which can transmit fire. It's recommended to not use mulch in a widespread or continuous manner. The recommendation is also to use larger sized wood mulch, those larger chip sizes. The picture on the left shows composted wood chips, actually from some shaded food bank work done at my property that was then chipped and allowed to compost over a several month period. And on the right, that's gorilla hair mulch. The recommendation is not to use gorilla hair. You can see in this picture from Fire Safe Marin how embers landed in that gorilla hair and can tend to smolder. And the risk is that firefighters may move on to defend another property, and those embers could flare up in that gorilla hair mulch, which is much finer and shredded and could spread fire to the home. Composted wood chips did demonstrate the least hazardous fire behavior overall of 8 mulch treatments tested in the study by the University of Nevada at Reno and the University of California. I am excited. I hear tell from some UC advisors that there's a new mulch study coming, and we're anxiously waiting for that, for some updated information on mulch flammability and best recommendations from a mulch perspective. The recommendation is to use, to separate your mulched islands of, you've got your islands of planting, and you want to mulch those islands of planting with about 2 to 3 inches of mulch. And then, of course, in higher fire risk areas, you might want to consider separating those mulched areas with non-combustible and ignition resistant materials, such as concrete or gravel, or even a native grass lawn, perhaps in your 5 to 30 foot zone. There's some great examples here. This is a rebuild in Fountain Grove area, the picture on the left, with a gravel path separating the mulched planted areas. And another picture from that property in Santa Rosa with that dry creek bed on the right. So again, the scientifically supported recommendation is for no organic mulch in the 0 to 5 foot zone, particularly for higher fire risk areas. I will highlight that in this picture, this is in Fountain Grove and a rebuild. During red flag warning day, you're going to want to move those wicker chairs away from the house. Those are definitely flammable. But it's a really nice example of how you can integrate inorganic materials in that zone and create some new ideas for how we utilize that space. So here's a quick recap on the FireWise design considerations in the defensible space zone. In the 0 to 5 foot zone from the house, you want to use no organic materials if possible, and use inorganic materials such as gravel or stepping stones. In that 5 to 30 foot zone from the house, you want to plant in islands with materials such as low herbaceous or non-woody perennials, grasses or succulents, and specimen or individual shrubs or trees. And then in the 30 to 100 foot zone from the house, those same basic principles as the 5 to 30 foot zone, but you can include shrub and tree groupings in widely spaced groups separated by areas that help break up the flow of wildfire. Again, ongoing maintenance is essential for a FireWise landscape, particularly with the drought and that extreme heat wave we had. Trust me, it was brutal up in Cloverdale, a couple 115 days, surrounded by 108 and 109 for 5 days. There's lots of leaf burn. Happily, we're hopefully moving into the end of fire season, but we still are in fire season. But if you've got any dead or dying branches in trees or shrubs from the drought or from that extreme heat wave, then you want to make sure you're removing those. Again, prune out any dead material from the interior shrubs if possible, and remove any ladder fuels. So hopefully this has given you a framework for assessing your landscape and making it more FireWise. For more information, we have lots of resources on the Master Gardener website that help you with water-wise and FireWise gardening and much, much more. And here's a link to our webpage. And you are always welcome to send any questions you have to our Master Gardener information desk via the email listed. So that's it for me. And I am going to now turn it over to our colleague, April Owens from the Habitat Corridor Project. And she gets the really fun part of the presentation and shows you all sorts of really beautiful plant pictures. April. April, you're muted. There you go.
I'm unmuted. Thank
Excellent.
you, Amy and John. That was a lovely setup for me. I will share my screen. everybody get up and wiggle a little bit because that's a lot of stuff. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes to go to the bathroom, get a glass of water, and come on back. And put a bunch of questions in the chat or in the Q&A and tell me more about what you love to work with natives. Are you using natives? Are you a rebuild? There's a lot of things I would love to know about your landscapes. I'm just gonna wait another minute. So while I'm speaking, I will not see the chat because it's super distracting. So I'm gonna get started. You know, it hasn't been 2 minutes. So I am April Owens, and I'm the executive director of the Habitat Corridor Project. I'm gonna try to get this chat going. Sorry. Maybe if I'm out of that. Okay, well, I'm just gonna go for it. So it's been so exciting to hear the other 2 speakers. It's been fun to work with Mimi and John and Ellie, and this whole Resilient Landscape Coalition has just been an amazing opportunity. So I tried to set my slides to Santa Rosa and like the Santa Rosa unit, but it looks like we are all over Sonoma County. So it'll work out. So I'm the executive director of the Habitat Corridor Project. We are small but mighty nonprofit. Our mission is to create and promote California native plant restoration gardens in the urban environment. We create, leading by example. We design and install California native plant gardens, replacing lawns and traditional water intensive landscapes, and creating demonstration gardens. We restore, we have created an amazing amount of square footage of wildlife habitat to support biodiversity in the urban landscape. And that's our big thing is education. So I'm very informal. So, but we have a lot of demonstration gardens and we work with a lot of groups, and it's fun for us to help you all understand how to use natives and create habitat in your landscapes. So resilient landscapes, I know John started talking about this, and I don't know that he shared our definition, but the way we have become thinking about these landscapes, and I'm a landscape designer and as well, is that we're thinking about these systems. Resilient landscapes consider drought, fire, development, and biodiversity. I feel like every year we're like, oh, it's a drought. Oh, there's a fire. Oh, we need to create biodiversity. So we're trying to link all of these pieces into our thoughts around your landscapes as residential landscapes, and also in like these broader landscapes in our communities and things. So I started as a landscape architect before I became a landscape architect, hiking in nature. And so I always recommend joining a native plant society walk or any kind of botanist walk to learn about Mother Nature and how she designs before you jump into your landscape. We all talk about sustainability, but I feel like it's been like this it's just like a greenwashing. So we really need to really think about sustainability. Like, what is sustainability? We are thinking about like, what our children and grandchildren are going to be thinking, like looking at in the future. So I really base my designs and Habitat Corridor Project designs on that Iroquois philosophy that the decisions we make today should result in a sustainable world 7 generations of the future. Can you imagine 7 generations in the future? I just want you to think about that for a second. We need to really own that. So back up from the philosophical heavy stuff, which is really, really important. I want to talk to you about, I am here to talk to you about plants and easy, attainable solutions to your 0 to 5, 5 to 30, and 30 to 100. So here's a nice overview. Patio wasn't too expensive. Using crushed rock patio out from the 0 to 5. This is a nice entertaining space. We used these steel edging to create, we were gonna put these nice shrubs in these spaces, but the client decided to plant their veggie garden there. So that's a lovely way to adapt to your garden. This is a beautiful, resilient landscape. And then out from the 30 to 100, there's a swale and some native plants. But why not use your landscape and plant in that? So I'm going to dive into 0 to 5. We have decorative rock and boulders. We have permeable hardscape, fountains for bees, birds, and butterflies, and containers. Remember that pollinators need food. So we've been creating these wonderful habitat fountains that could go in this space in with your 0 to 5 rock mulches and all kinds of things that will look forward. But just think about pollinators and how and I'm going to ribbon this through my talk, but like pollinators need food, cover, and water. So we need to keep thinking about that. And so in this 0 to 5, we can look at places to capture water and fountains. This is kind of a simple garden we just completed. Well, obviously didn't complete, but this is 4 inches of base rock. I'm just going to give you some really good tips from installing, because I'm installing. So 4 inches of base rock, and then a nice cobble mix over, and then a lovely little island that's probably 6 by 10. And we eventually added a lean green compost mix as a mulch over, because we didn't feel comfortable that the arbor mulch was too close in this zone. A lovely photo in Glen Ellen by Ellie Ensley, one of our partners, in the 0 to 5, some cobble and a pathway. These are wonderful places. We've like Mimi was saying, we have had shrubs along the house and pathways out in the landscape, but now we can think about pathways closer to the house in our 0 to 5 and looking at the plants out in the landscape. Another lovely landscape with some pavers against the house and some other opportunities outside the landscape. This doesn't have to be fancy concrete pavers. It could just be crushed rock. Another space where we've come off a deck that is highly fire. It's not great for fire. And then the next step is concrete. And then the next step is these wonderful pavers, and then using steel edging and a shale driveway. So think about your landscape working out from your house. And later we'll talk about your landscape working from the landscape to the house. This is just a little wiggle room. This is a wheel, like a red Festuca rubra, red fescue, grassy area, and then a swale and a swale path. So we would be in with the thoughts of maintenance. This time of year, this was like late spring. So this time of year, we would be cutting back this grass and making sure it's well hydrated. But this is a way to get a little bit of softness along the house. We really don't want in your 0 to 5 to have anything other than rock or gravel or all these kind of creative ideas. But I just wanted to say that sometimes this is the west side, this north side of the house. It's darker and cooler, so you can have a little bit of plant material here. On the right, we have a swale and a swale. We have a swale. So we before we did all this research, we actually had gravel, mulch up against the house. And this swale on the right is where we edited and we brought in more pebble along the house, and we did the swale. And then it was making sure it drained away from the home, and then adding just a little bit of plants. So here's just a tiny bit of wiggle room that you can have. And please reach out to me how you can have a little wiggle room. Design 0 to 5 existing trees. I like this photo because it's not what we want to see, but I also love this iconic barn in Healdsburg. So this is a coast live oak against an iconic barn with a metal roof. And so this, if it was to be any kind of opportunity that we are trying to see, you'd want to limb up that tree. Even like, so even barns and accessory buildings have to be thought of in this landscape in the 0 to 5. So limb up that tree, bring in some more biodiverse habitat later out in the landscape. But we just want to keep reminding you that it's just, if you want your trees, which we need our trees, and coast live oaks are an amazing powerhouse of habitat, you need vigilant maintenance in the fire season. It's really important. And reach out to us again if you need help with this. So going into the 5 to 30, this is where we take a deep breath. So 0 to 5, you gotta like get everything out and be really careful. But 5 to 30 is low growing, low fuel, rock mulch between plantings and well hydrated. Sorry. So the next, thinking about paths and swales, I just want to show you how we created a swale in up at the Bennett Ridge community after the fires. This was one of our first fire resilient landscapes that we created as a business. So if you look to the left, it was just a blank slate. Like there was a pool. Apparently before there was a pool and they buried the pool. And then we started thinking about where would the water would go. And so we built in the swale low place in the garden to collect water and actually move it up. So we thought about where's the water going to go? And so this was the second step in the middle photo. And then this was 1 year later, seeing how the grasses were coming up. We created this lovely grass swale. So it doesn't have to be a big boulder swale. And this is a very low cost kind of situation. But in smaller landscapes, this is a beautiful example of a swale in a very small landscape near the Mark West area in Santa Rosa near Mission Boulevard. So you can also create, it was lovely because it rained right after we built this, but it doesn't have to be a giant garden. It can be a very small garden. Just thinking about sinking water in on your site, and then as it goes, there was a drain out to the drainage. So it's a lovely way to create water in your landscape or sink it in. And then pathways. So swales or pathways in this zone. So this is a lovely pathway that we created, and it could be giant or it can be small with boulders and small field stones, and this just drain rock and some very inexpensive pressure treated wood to create these steps. So it doesn't have to be a super expensive endeavor. It can be just drain rock over base rock. Here's another smaller landscape situation. This cute little house in Grayton had what Mimi was talking about, a foundation planting of boxwood and a bunch of grass and a bunch of concrete. So they reached out to us and said, what can we do with this? And this is what we did. All you have to do, we got some little pavers that are permeable, and we brought in some soil, and they are so excited to hang out in their front yard now, but they never hung out because it was just this little weird little foundation planting. And then the next year, 1 year later, on the right, you're seeing they are just dazzled by the butterflies and bumblebees coming and birds coming to their garden 1 year later. Design 30 to 100. This is where we get more habitat and larger islands between shrubs and plenty of space between. So we haven't really talked, and it hasn't been dialed in what these islands and how big they are. So larger islands I see in my world of a designer is 15 feet by 6 feet by 10 feet or so. And smaller islands, maybe in the 5 to 30 or 10 feet by 3 feet. And you always want a generous spacing between them. And even in the 30-100, if you want pathways, it's safer and more fire resilient if you can have crushed rock or pebble or whatever the least expensive or whatever your budget affords. So design 30 to 100. I love this photo because it's backed out. So in the first photo, we looked in from the outside, but now this is backed out by 100 feet. So we're seeing stacked stone walls and some islands of planting. And as this garden went up, this is that garden with the swale. So I'm kind of repeating this garden throughout this presentation. They've also cleaned up their roof line and all of their Douglas firs and redwoods. So they're creating this buffer from the outside in. Design 30 to 100, we are also thinking this is a place where you can have a hedgerow, which is a larger grouping of shrubs for biodiversity, and also multiple perennials and groupings that can sustain habitat. So in this photo, we have some milkweed, which we're all super excited about to support the monarch butterflies. So this is slender milkweed and showy milkweed in this photo. And in the background, you see that this house had burned in the 2017 fire. And right after that fire, we came in and started building back habitat even before the house was being built. So thinking about where is the space that we can in 30 to 100 build in habitat. Some California native shrubs that I suggest in this space in the 30 to 100, and maybe a few in the 5 to 30, more sparse, but Toyon, Heteromalays arboretophilia, California, they call it Christmas berry as well. You can make your beautiful wreaths. So this plant supports all sorts of habitat, especially birds and for nesting. And then coffeeberry, which supports an array of pollinators and birds in the fall. All of our coffee berries, it's fascinating to just watch them in the spring to see, and late summer to see the thousands of different pollinators that are visiting them. I've been trying to nerd out on them, but it's a lot to learn. California lilac is another lovely hedgerow plant. I highly recommend. So I'm trying to represent plants that can be all over the county, especially in Santa Rosa. So California lilac, we have a lot of different cultivars and species, but I love like Julia Phelps and Thriciflorus. This is at our Habitat Corridor project in Sebastopol at the Center for the Arts. And what to use between these masses of plants in this really big zone that you can use for biodiversity, and even in your 5 to 30. So you can use rock mulch, like in the second picture, in your 5 to 30 as pathways. But in the 30 to 100, you get the opportunity to have a 2-inch layer of arbor mulch. And you could have mowed California native bunch grasses or well-maintained ground covers. So I always like to ask folks, why use California native plants? And I'm curious, do you use them? Do you know them? How can we help you understand them better? So add your why to the chat. I'll say that later because I can't say it now. Some answers that we've had from our local experts is they're keeping local insects and animal populations thriving. They reduce need for water. Bringing in other species potentially spreads exotic diseases. Beauty, blooming season matches our climate. Plus, using natives, another fun aspect challenge to gardening as a hobby. It helps start conversations with your neighbors. This is my favorite. When you replace your non-native plants with natives, you get this interaction in your neighborhood that is completely exciting. I'm going to give you a second to add your stuff in the chat. I think John or Mimi talked about how many natives, like what do you do next? So I recommend, well, I use 100% native in my gardens, but I'm fine and you will be so delighted with 80% California native plants that are local to your plant community. And John talked about Calflora, Calscape. There's a lot of web resources that we'll send out to you and that are in the chat. And I'm sure they're chatting with you right now, calflora.org. So you can look up your local area and you can find out what's native there. So 80% California plants is kind of our general motto at the Resilient Landscape Coalition. 20% favorite pollinator plants are annuals and containers. Like, do you love those Mediterranean plants? There's plenty of them to love. That equals biodiversity. And you'll see an amazing level of habitat in your garden. It's so fun to see the extra level. I love plants. I'm a plant junkie, but to see that level of pollinators and bumblebees and birds in your garden, you could just sit out there and just chill out on a Sunday afternoon like I do and just enjoy that space. There's just one thing I want to talk to you about with plants. So now we're on plant mode. So all of these plants, buckwheat, salvias, California fuchsias, there's cultivars versus species. So there's lower growing ones, there's bigger plants. So you just need to look into what you're planting and understand how big they are, how low they are, where they fit in your landscape, how much water they need. So Mimi talked about that a little bit, but it's really important to understand that you can have these plants in your garden, even if it's super tiny, you just have to pick the right plant. So I want to talk for a second about hydrating your landscape, maybe 10 seconds. So I've switched to hydrating because it's complicated. In some landscapes, we've been using MP rotators, which are these pop-up heads that you're seeing here that are low water use. But you have to, but the issue is that you need to make sure they pop up high enough to irrigate your landscape properly. And then you could do a grid of drip, which you need to make sure that you run it properly to irrigate the whole landscape. So John and I have been talking a lot about what is the best landscape irrigation, and Mimi too. We were trying to figure this out. Some in our smaller landscapes, we use little circles of inline drip. So it's complicated. If you have a small landscape, I feel like, I know this is controversial, but overhead watering or usually the little sprinkler can help you see what you're irrigating and make sure you soak the soil and see what the plants are needing. If you're using drip and at point, they call it point source drip, you need to make sure that as the plant grows, you're moving that irrigation head out from the plant. So you're irrigating its whole drip zone, its whole life zone. So I just wanted to encourage you all to see this fun site that we've created, the Master Gardeners, Mimi and I, and the Habitat Corridor Project, amongst many organizations like Snow My Water and such. The Living Learning Landscapes.com, they're all going in. A lot of them have happened. And so you can come out and you can look on the website, and you can also come out and see these gardens or participate in some work days and learn how to work with these plants. So I just encourage you to come out and join us for that. So I'm wrapping up in just a minute. So tips for successful habitat gardens. So I am coming from the Habitat Corridor Project. So we just want to make sure that you are encouraged to not just plant one native in your garden. You want large groupings of plants, 3 to 5, depending on how big your garden is. You want many types of flowers and flowering at different times. You want to provide plants that both provide nectar and pollen sources. We can help you reach out. You want to add water to the garden. This is one of the things that I'm really trying to have folks understand. Even if you have a drip irrigation system, maybe there's one boulder that you put one little drip on and it has a little shallow source for water. So you can, when your irrigation system is running, the pollinators can get to it. Add water to the garden. Think of cover. So I don't see any birds coming to a garden until there's cover. So you need that layer of cover that I talked about earlier, or you're not going to see any birds. They stay away until they are safe. And then leave a little mess, a small brush pile, not in your 0 to 5, maybe in your 30 to your 5 to 30, just a little tiny bit. You can clean it up in the more fire severities times. But birds love to grab, even leaving. I know people leave socks and little bits of twine and things for birds. It really is important. So this is my why for our future of our children, because things aren't looking good. We got to change things. So I am excited to see all of my fellow Resilient Landscape Coalition people back on. Here are our websites, and we will be sending out this recording to all of you. And I don't know, Jennifer, do you have a final slide, or is this the final slide?
Hello, I'm here.
Hello.
This is our final slide for tonight.
So take a picture. This is a lot of our websites, and we will make sure you get all this stuff. And I will stop share so we can answer questions soon.
All right. Thank you, April.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you to our other presenters and to our attendees who are still here tonight. So we will switch over to our panelist mode. So we're here to answer your questions.
And Paul Lowenthal, I always like to hear what you think about trees in the landscape as we start off.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you everybody for being here tonight. And, Mimi and Ellie and I have had a chance to talk about a lot of our firsthand experiences following what we saw in 2017, where there really wasn't a lot that could be done. and then where we're at today and what we experienced in 2020. And we are actually seeing in real time a lot of these efforts paying off. Trees limbed up, defensible space zones, planting correctly, limiting where mulches are used, but also understanding the importance of mulches and the fact that people think that they're bad isn't necessarily true, that there's a lot of benefits to them. And what we saw, like I said, in 2020 was a real firsthand experience that shows that workshops like this and the work that people are doing truly does pay off. And those that aren't doing it are unfortunately suffering the consequences. So with that, I'm excited to see a lot of these efforts continuing to move forward and a lot of the organizations continuing to come together, because ultimately we have seen what seems to be the new normal continue to take place within our community. And it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. But hopefully with, again, the efforts that are taking place here, we'll be able to do a better job of defending homes and protecting properties when residents are doing their part to make their properties more wildfire ready.
Can we start in on some of the questions in the Q&A?
Yes.
I'd love to hear if, Paul, do you have, we always, well, periodically we get the question about fire resistant tarps, which I referenced on the wood piles. Do you have specific recommendations and can you make recommendations of where they're available? That was one of the questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, that question does come up from time to time. And really, the last time we went through this, it was honestly better just with supply and demand is to Google fire resistant tarp, and you'll get a lot of good hits at some of the more reputable sources. And that's really been people's best bet right now.
So, actually, Paul, I'd like to ask you about that because I am vacillating between fire retardant canvas tarps and vinyl tarps that are fire retardant. And I wonder if you could speak to that, because I would much rather get a canvas one. And of course, the websites that promote canvas ones say that they're better. The ones that promote vinyl ones say that they're better.
I don't know what the history is of just what the exposure is to them or how they'll hold up over time. I will tell you that we use canvas tarps. That is something that we regularly use when we're doing what's called salvage on a house fire or structure fire, is we will physically put people's belongings together and cover them with a legitimate canvas tarp. So it's an industry standard to use them to protect property from embers and falling fire debris. Yes, they will burn. You'll get holes in them, but they don't freely burn. And again, that also depends on how they're being stored, how they're being maintained, and what the breakdown is over time. But we use them.
I have a poly tarp that's supposed to be fireproof or fire resistant, and it's been out now in the sun on a wood pile for a year and a half, 2 years, and it's already started to deteriorate.
Oh.
And I got the heavy duty one, so I'm going for canvas next.
We'll look for your recommendation in a year and a half after that experience. Shall I go to the next question? I love this next question from Meg about what's the matter with bare soil in the 0 to 5 foot zone. And I had meant to reference in my presentation, and thank you for the question, Meg. I had this really wonderful conversation with one of our premier fire advisors, Yana Velikovich, who works up in Humboldt and Delaware County and works a lot at the state level and advocacy work on defensible space recommendations with CAL FIRE and state government officials. And we had this wonderful conversation. She actually had a conversation with Caroline Safford, who many of you know, I'm sure are familiar with here in Sonoma County for all the work she's done over the years with Fire Safe Sonoma and now with Permit Sonoma in this space, and is leading up a lot of the county CWPP efforts. She made a great suggestion. Sometimes this can be really overwhelming. And Meg, I'll say I've got some bare soil in my high fire severity zone around my house. And but it's weedier. And I'm really having to stay on top of my weeds there. It's still going to be weedy when I want to put some gravel, some drain rock in there, some less expensive drain rock. It's on my list. But the recommendation from Caroline was like, start on one side of your house. Pick maybe your highest fire risk exposure that probably all of us are aware of, given our fire experiences here in Sonoma County, and start with that one. But bare soil is okay. I don't know, Paula, do you have some perspectives that you would weigh in on this topic? I just wanted to share. I thought that was just such a great recommendation. Don't feel overwhelmed like you have to do the whole thing all at once. Let's start chipping away at maybe one side of the house, and either it's choosing to leave a bare soil and taking on the weeding. It gets very weedy for me at my property in Cloverdale. But Paul, do you have some perspective on that?
Yeah, and we've had that conversation a lot of times where people bring us out or our staff out and want recommendations. They end up with a laundry list that can be quite daunting and overwhelming at sometimes. I know we visited a large complex that's just outside of our wildland urban interface, and our conversation was with them was what's your highest risk in this particular area, and in some cases everybody's so concerned about the north wind event, which is the most high likely significant damage, but low probability event. Unfortunately, we've had a lot of them recently, but the more common wildfires that we have here locally are driven by our coastal influence and typically come out of the winds out of the southwest. And so it's that fine line. It depends on which direction you want to protect from, but then what's coming from those directions. If you're up against the foothills of Santa Rosa, you're likely going to want to protect your backyard from something that could push down during, a wind event. If you're up against Annandale State Park or Spring Lake or Howard Park, you're probably more susceptible to actually a typical coastal influence afternoon and not as much of a high fire danger day. So don't hesitate to reach out to your local fire official or through one of the organizations that are represented here to help with some of that. But you're correct. It is oftentimes a really good starting point to just pick one side and go from there.
Do you have a direct opinion on bare soil versus inorganic, like gravel or concrete?
Well, I've learned a lot about bare soil from you guys, actually, and just the concerns that it, and you can tell, I've watched it at some of our own fire stations where they're so, almost like heeding to the community's concern that they got to remove this, they got to remove that. And then they go and scrape everything, or I've seen it in my own neighborhood. And then you see the health of the plants because it is bare and it's not used to it. And then you start seeing the impacts that it has on the shrubs and the brush. So, up against the house immediately, whether it's the 5 feet of bare soil or the gravel or rock, I don't really see much of a difference. I do try and stress that people really shouldn't be pulling everything back to 30 feet away. That seems to be what the normal was, or what people thought they had to do. They thought they had to clean up all their oak tree fallout and all the leaf litter and literally just wipe their yard out. And it wasn't necessarily making them better long-term, because we're starting to see the health of the yard deteriorate.
So I will add that a little bit of bare soil, depending on the location, is actually good, because there's ground nesting native bees. And so if you go to any of the beekeeper sites, they'll say, leave a little bit of bare soil for the bees, but then don't go barefoot anywhere around that.
And that's why that's the beauty of these, so that we have people like Ellie that know that type of stuff, and I don't.
Yeah, even City of Santa Rosa, they require a certain amount of mulch over the site, and then they say 5% can be left for native bees. So I agree with Ellie.
That's a perfect segue to the next question, I think.
There's an anonymous attendee who says, and I said that we would answer this live, so it's not in the open questions.
Sure.
But it's I have a tulip tree in the front yard and a Japanese maple in the back, which drop many leaves. If I plant anything, it might be difficult and time consuming to rake or sweep around all the plants to clean up the leaves that fall. Would be interested to hear other suggestions. Artificial turf is one option. Any other ideas for natural alternatives? We don't recommend artificial turf, because that will really almost literally kill the soil. If you don't let air or sunlight in, then all the creatures that John mentioned will not have any food or reason to live. But I want to turn that over to John or April or Mimi or Jen.
Yeah, I'll take a stab. It's a great question, and kind of the issue of leaf litter and wood mulch kind of generally. I have, I guess, a similar situation. I have some Japanese maples that came with the house, which we've owned for 22 years, and a neighbor has a tulip tree, which drops copious amounts of leaves. So in the case of the Japanese maple, because the leaves are very small and because it's not, we're not talking about, in my case, the 0 to 5 foot zone, we're talking about 30 feet probably from the house. Very small leaves that don't hang around for very long. So I just let them fall into the wood mulch that's there and decompose on their own. I don't make any effort to clean those up. The tulip tree leaves are much bigger. I don't do much for that either, but I do some cleanup around individual plants. Again, I'm not allowing them to blow up against the house and that sort of thing. I have the advantage, and I understand probably most people don't, that I can just kind of gather up leaves, and if I get some wood mulch, I don't really care because I put it in the chicken yard and they can pick through the leaves and find any bugs, and of course they break down and feed the pill bugs and worms and things and give the chickens lots of food. And the fact that I'm moving some wood mulch, which I get for free from a tree company, moving it from one place to where the chicken yard is, that's no great loss. So I like the idea of an organic mulch, and don't worry, maybe compost those leaves, and if it has some wood mulch in it, don't worry about it. If you've spent a lot of money on gravel, then it would be good to not be raking that up with the leaves and then having to figure out what to do with the gravelly leaf.
What about plants, though? I think is her question. So that, because we're saying that you can, you might want to have some actual plants. Are there any good plants that she could put under?
Yeah, well, I guess I don't see the falling leaves as being a deterrent to growing good plants. The plants will largely benefit, but obviously if they're getting buried, then you would need to unbury them. So if we're talking about that level of leaves. So yeah, I get them in, within ground cover manzanitas, where I feel kind of compelled to rake them out with a little hand rake and expose the plants better again. But I'm not a particularly tidy gardener in that sense. And that certain amount of messiness, again, if it's safe, is often generally beneficial for wildlife and so forth.
I was thinking maybe plants like iris, that are already a little bit vertical, and when the leaves fall down around them, they'll, but I have a bunch of iris, and I also have some strawberry, native strawberry, and I don't use a blower because I think of a blower as just basically a hot wind, and it's not going to be really nice for the plant. So I actually use my hands and just gently move the leaves off and just sort of slide them off to the side. If it's too close to your house, that's, you're going to need to get the leaves. So it's not as easy to rake or blow. So it's kind of a balance, that, as John pointed out, being intimate with your plants. Well, this is a way to nurture them. And, but if you want to be fully maintenance free, then it's probably a better idea to put mulch or, some of the things that John was talking about. But really, I wouldn't recommend artificial turf, because if you kill the soil, then the roots of the tree won't be happy and your tree will start to be distressed, which is, assumingly that's undesirable.
Shall we move on to the wood chips question? I'm not quite sure what angle Deborah's coming from when she asks, how can wood chips be used with fire prevention in mind? Certainly, I think we stressed all the recommendations of no wood mulch in 0 to 5, wood mulch in islands of plantings 2 to 3 inches deep. I don't know, Paul, do you have any perspective with wood chips being used with fire prevention in mind?
Yeah, it depends on where you're at, but I have seen them used a lot to help mitigate weed abatement. Pretty regularly, especially in areas that are really susceptible to seasonal grasses, and the seasonal grasses, even when they're cut down to 4 feet, will still carry fire, especially under a wind condition, pretty rapidly. But when you have a mulch preventing that growth, it is beneficial. So even the city, when we did a number of chipper programs, we took a lot of that chip waste and used it actually for weed control up in Nagasawa Park in Fountain Grove. So there's definitely some benefits to it.
Paul, I'm curious if I could add on to that question a little bit. I sometimes hear homeowners concerned about the idea of sheet mulching, using cardboard first And then, the 2 to 3 inches of mulch on top, thinking cardboard is, that's highly flammable. That's not a good idea. I guess my personal feeling has been if you use that, put that down, say in the late fall or in the winter, it gets a normal, hopefully, winter season of rainfall on it. It's going to be, fairly decomposed by the time the next, late summer comes around. Your thoughts?
Yeah, and you're correct. Yes, it stands out like a sore thumb when it's being put down. But typically after a good season, depending on the timing of it, it does break down pretty quickly. And I have not seen it as a factor in a number of the fires that we've had. That's not to say it's not possible, but I have not seen it as a factor. The types of mulches and where there are is 100% what I see time and time again.
Okay, Doug asks if the 0 to 5 foot starts from outside the wood deck or from the house. The wood deck's attached to the house. It's around that 0 to 5 applies around that wood deck as well. Doug, so play that. Paul, would you answer and add anything on that? That seems like a pretty black and white.
Yeah, no, it's
answering question.
Yes, you're correct.
And then I know that the seasonal creek question, Ellie's going to be super helpful on that one, but I wanted to maybe skip to Laura's question first about, since it's a deck related one as well, are composite decks less flammable than redwood? Do you have some lens on that, Paul?
Yeah, theoretically, the redwood, depending on what you've done with it, how long it's been there, what condition it's under, and what's leading up to it, is not going to be great. But regardless of what you have, it really comes down to what you're storing around it, what you're storing underneath it, and what kind of clearance you have in place and the maintenance you're doing of the deck. We have seen time and time again where people think the deck needs to go, that the deck is not, and especially if you have defensible space, you've got your clearances, the deck is not going to magically catch fire. The decks are catching fire because of what's, again, underneath them, around them, up on top of them. And if you're truly taking all the steps that you should be taking, your redwood deck may be fine. And again, we can't continue to stress it enough that if you truly do take all the steps, your survivability, your chances of preventing that fire spread do significantly skyrocket.
Great answer. And then I'm going to turn to Ellie, because Ellie used to do native creek restoration work in a previous life. With Laura's question, I have a seasonal creek that partially runs near the main house. It is filled with willows. Is it necessary to limb up all of them, or are they less flammable?
Well, my first question is, and Paul can also answer this, I'm sure everybody else as well, but how close is the creek to your house? If it's in the 30 to 100 zone, you don't need to limb them all up. The seasonal creeks are really important for keeping the plants are really important for keeping the water cool. If it's seasonal, then you're not worried about fish. But creeks are really great places for wildlife. And there's the Department of Fish and Wildlife. You have to be careful what you're doing, because there are regulations about what you do within the bed and banks of the stream. So the first thing is, how far is it from your house?
She said about 15 feet.
How many?
15.
15. Yeah, that's awfully close. Okay, so the first thing, and I think Paul should be answering this as well. Creeks, the vegetation, so you definitely need to get everything that's dead and dying out from them. And you want to make sure that you have patches that are there for wildlife. The Ecology Center has done a lot of work in riparian zones, especially for Oakmont. And when they were doing large areas of streams, they did get the regulatory agencies involved to make sure that they weren't doing anything that was going to be problematic from a regulatory standpoint. So in the area that's closest to your home, I would probably go in, limb up, and then as you get farther away from the house, I would leave larger patches, but I might actually make breaks, like little fire breaks between the areas that you've limbed up and kind of cleaned up from down below, so that if a fire is coming along the creek, that it will actually reach one of those breaks and can't continue, because you don't want a fuse going along up to your house. What do you have to say about that, Paul?
Well, Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I was actually going to take it a little bit of a different direction really quickly. Just that I think Ellie and I experienced it pretty significantly out in the Oakmont area, but there really is a misconception of what should be done in creeks. There seems to be a thought process that heavily brushed and treed and covered creeks are bad and that they are going to carry fire and spread fire. And we watched a creek bed in Skyhawk literally stop the fire, where on the north side of Mountain Hawk Drive, that creek was relatively dry, and the fuels in that area didn't have a lot of canopy and cover, and which helps keep the humidities up. And the fire blew right through it, and it got down to the bottom of Mountain Hawk Drive, where it transitions to more of a heavily densely canopy covered rich creek bed, and the fire literally stopped there. And the intensity of that fire it wasn't the road. I mean, it burned the houses at the bottom of the creek bed at Mountain Hawk Drive. So we saw that a little bit in Oakmont too, where there was a desire to just go in and rip things apart. But keep in mind, when you do that, you're opening the canopy, you're changing the ecology, and you truly are drying those out a lot more than you typically would, especially when we're in the dry season. So, and again, and I hate to keep saying it over and over again, but it really does highlight the importance of groups like this that are able to see that hands-on, be out there in the field and help make some of those decisions and help guide.
And I just wrote a note back to her saying, reach out to us. I put in my email address, but John, you and I could talk, but please reach out to us, because especially when you're dealing with creeks and you have habitat issues and regulatory issues, it's good to speak to somebody and have that person really go and see the site and help you out with your question.
So we're about at time, but we had one last wrap-up question from Doug. So the deck is not considered flammable. I'm not sure that's exactly what Paul said.
No.
Yeah.
The deck is still flammable. A house is still flammable, but what you do around the deck and around the home and underneath the deck reduces the potential of the deck combusting, catching fire, and becoming a fuel source. So again, and I personally watched it in not only Skyhawk, but in Oakmont during the glass fire. There was many decks. There was a lot of wood decks that were in and around the fire's perimeter, and fires were literally burning up to the decks, but they were running out of fuel, and the fire essentially went out without us doing anything. The only thing we had to worry about was the embers that were raining down into the gutters, but the deck itself, they weren't touched. The decks that were burned were burned because the residents didn't do their parts or misunderstood what steps they should have taken and had yards set up to where it actually carried fire to the deck and then from the deck to the home.
So it's a perfect example of why that 0 to 5 foot zone, that zone 0, applies around the perimeter of the decks. So that was perfect close.
And I actually I have stapled from underneath the inside of the deck. I put 1/8 inch wire mesh down on the skirt as a skirt under my deck. So because leaves blow in there, and my deck is like 10 to 15 feet wide, and you can't get a rake in there all day long when you need to.
All right. Jill,
All
you want
right.
to bring us to close?
Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight.
Thank
And
you, Paul. That was so helpful.
Thank you, Paul.
Here.
Always
Oh
a
my
pleasure.
goodness.
Thank you for having me.
thank you so much. And you'll be hearing from us by email, and please visit our website. Thank you, everybody.
And Laura, if you'd like to reach us, my email is newts, NEWTS @vom.com, VOM.com.
Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Bye.
Stay safe.